call this the eclipse cycle. Yeah? And the eclipse cycle, to me, represents the maturation of consciousness within that 18.6 years. Yeah? So for example, this is Saturn Girl. And I haven't done a video since the election in November. Okay? There were many reasons for that. Number one, my existence is becoming illegal bit by bit. And number two, I had to decompress. Now, number three, my main revenue stream has changed. I'm mostly doing adult content now. Shh. Okay? But this is a really important video because we're now in an eclipse season 2025. And we're going to be talking about what this means for you and for us in general. Okay? However, like I said, I haven't done a video since the election. I know I predicted that Kamala Harris would win, and I know I was wrong. But I was interpreting the astrology, and my life depended on it. But here we are, with a Donald Trump victory. And the predictions I made in previous videos have proved to be pretty prescient. I predicted a Christo-fascist dictatorship emerging, which already is, and demonizing both immigrants and trans people, which is already happening, and it will get worse. Remember, 1935 was the Nuremberg laws in Germany, and they basically said that Jews couldn't employ non-Jews, that Jews couldn't engage in certain activities, and that they essentially had no rights. We're getting there with trans people, and we've already gotten there with immigrants. Anyway, the important part about this is the eclipse cycle. We'll talk about the astrology of the United States in future videos. So, number one, what are eclipses? Well, you probably know they're when the sun, moon, and earth all align. Now, a lunar eclipse happens with a full moon in about 15 degrees or so of one of the lunar nodes. And a solar eclipse is a new moon that happens within about 15 degrees or so of the lunar nodes. Now, what are the lunar nodes? Well, they are the points where the moon's orbit intersects the Earth's. Why is that important? Because those are the places where sun, moon, and Earth all align, you see? When you have a lunar eclipse, it's the Earth passing between the sun and the moon. And therefore, we see the moon darken, right? And it takes on a dark reddish hue oftentimes. With a solar eclipse, it's the moon that passes between the sun and the Earth. Therefore, the sun is eclipsed. You may have heard the lunar nodes referred to as the dragon's head and the dragon's tail. Now, why is that? Because to ancient people, it appeared as if a dragon was devouring the sun or the moon, right? Depending on the nature of the eclipse. So mostly they were considered ill omens from ancient Mesopotamia all the way to medieval times. And really up until around the Enlightenment, right? In the 16 and 1700s. Now, eclipses are super important because we can think of them as supercharged, yes. Now, we know that new moons are sort of like new beginnings, right? Every month. And full moons are sort of like culminations or endings. Therefore, in our modern parlance, we can think of lunar eclipses as super big endings and solar eclipses as super big beginnings, right? The important thing also is that these eclipses, lunar and solar, typically happen within about 2 weeks of each other. And that's an important symbolic point, especially in this case, which we'll get to in just a minute. But the lunar nodes had a couple different meanings in different contexts. In ancient astrology, the north node was said to increase things, both the good and the bad, while the south node was said to decrease them. Again, both the good and the bad. Yes? Now, in Vedic astrology, the north node was considered to be what we pursue, often to our own detriment, that which consumes us like a dragon does, right? And the South Node was sort of considered to be the spiritual side, right? The way of liberation, right? The subjective side that kind of takes us out of the worldly pursuits. Now, in modern astrology, we often think of the North Node as the future or the direction we're moving in, and the South Node as the past or what we've already accomplished in life. Some people even consider it past lives, like Stephen Forrest in evolutionary astrology, which I could do without. I think it's... But each to their own, knock yourself out. I mean, I like Stephen Forrest's work on out-of-bounds planets, but, it all sounds like theosophy to me. Now, we talked a little bit about eclipses and their symbolism, and the lunar nodes and their symbolism. So, one big event we have to be aware of that just happened in January is that the lunar nodes changed signs. Now, this happens about every year and a half or so. And it's part of a greater cycle, an 18.6-year cycle, which is often referred to as lunar precession, right? It's the amount of time it takes the nodes to return to their same place in the zodiac. Once again, about 18.6 years. You see? So, each of those year and a half periods within that greater 18.6-year cycle represents a phase, what I call eclipse phases. Yes. If we think of that greater 18.6-year cycle as the eclipse cycle, then we can think of these periods when the nodes oscillate, right? Or when they're in a pair of signs. That means the eclipses mostly oscillate between those two signs. Therefore, the two whole sign houses involved will take on a major significance in that phase. Now, we'll enumerate those phases in just a minute. But I just want to once again emphasize that the sign that the lunar nodes are in will indicate the emphases in your life right now. Now, I call this the eclipse cycle, yeah? And the eclipse cycle, to me, represents the maturation of consciousness within that 18.6 years, yeah? So, for example, those of you who are Pisces rising have a focus on identity, first house, and relationships, seventh house. And what we notice with this, of course, this is the beginning of the eclipse cycle. I consider this the first phase, and everyone is at different places in their lives, of course. But for example, our identities affect how we relate to other people, and how we relate to other people affects how we relate to ourselves, doesn't it? And we'll get to that more in just a minute. But what do I mean by maturation of consciousness? I mean growing more and more into who you already are. Now, a lot of us do everything unconsciously, and we're just dragged through life on autopilot. But the eclipse cycle teaches us that we have an opportunity here, right? We have an opportunity for choice and to demonstrate our will. Now, 99% of life just happens to us. It's completely fated. We have no choice. It just happens, yeah? But the 1% that matters, I made all those numbers up, okay? But the 1% that matters is the direction in which we will put our attention. It's where you choose to put your attention. Because where your attention goes, there you go. So when I speak of maturation in consciousness, it's not a done deal. It's not assumed that you're going to progress as a person. However, at each phase, you have these opportunities. And whether or not you choose to recognize and participate in them, they will be done to you. And you will see new beginnings and endings in these areas of life. Yes, that is what I call the eclipse cycle. Now, Let's look at what I mean by the eclipse cycle. Yes, let's bring up this silly chart here. Where is this chart? Oh, here it is. Let's bring it up here. So let's just talk about the phases here, right? We start the eclipse cycle in our lives, yes, at the 1st and 7th house phase. Now, when I said this has to do with identity and relationships, that's once again because who we are affects how we relate to others, and how we relate to others affects how we relate to ourselves. You see, this is coming out of a sense of death. It's coming out of a sense of finality. And this is a crisis because we often get faced with ourselves. A lot of times we'll see bodily injuries. We'll see changes to our health oftentimes. We'll see big new beginnings in our health or in our sense of identity. We get faced with parts of ourselves that we've avoided, and this can be quite traumatic. We also oftentimes have big changes in relationships. We may meet someone new. We may go through a big breakup. We may have both. But typically, the events that happen with regards to the 7th house make us challenge our sense of ourselves. Who am I? What does this mean? Why am I going through this? Yeah. Now, the next phase after that is the 12th and 6th house phase. Yeah. Now that I consider to be the cocoon phase, right? It's where we assimilate all the challenges that we went through in terms of identity and relationship. We often get faced with mental health challenges, more physical health challenges, right? Having to deal with new directions or changes in our daily routines. And also, with regards to our sense of isolation, we often take ourselves out of public life to develop and to change and become more of what we already are. Now, the phase after that is the 11th and 5th house phase. And I call this the light of day phase, you see? It's where we emerge into, it's like the butterfly coming out of the cocoon, yeah? It's when we emerge into a greater sense of light. It's not always fun and good, but for the most part, it's where we start to enjoy ourselves again, where we start to connect with people again, where we get a renewed sense of optimism, and we start to set our sights ahead on new horizons and recognize new possibilities. Now, the 5th house, as I also said, is children. So, I always tell people to watch out and use protection during that phase too. Now, this brings us to the next most important phase after the 1st and 7th. And this is the 10th and 4th house phase. I call this the manifestation phase, you see? Because we often have big new beginnings in terms of our career and life direction, and big new beginnings and endings in terms of our living situation, our history, our parents, yes, and our private lives. When I went through this phase, I not only moved out of state, moved out of my city for the first time in my entire life, but I also quit my job of 20 years and started my small business. Still pretty small, but gotta water it. Still kind of going. Business. But once again, for those of you, I think who are Gemini risings or Sagittarius risings right now, you are in a very, very important phase in your life, so relish it. Also, Pisces, Virgo people, Pisces, Virgo rising, once again, very important phase. The phase after that is the 9th and 3rd house phase, you see? And that phase I call the reflection phase. You see, we've departed from this major activity phase where life direction, living situation can all be shooken up, right? And then the next phase is about what does it all mean? We start to reflect and look back at what we've accomplished in the previous phase. And we start to consider what that means. We consider our values and how we communicate them. Oftentimes, we come to new beliefs, new worldviews, greater understandings, yes? And the 3rd house is how we communicate those. For example, I've been in this phase for the past year and a half, right? We just came out of it. Yeah. However, my experience in this challenged all of my spiritual beliefs and perspectives. In fact, I got quite antagonistic to what I used to believe. And then the third house indicated a total change in communication. Yes? And my emphasis started shifting into streaming once that phase happened for me. Of course, I do different types of streaming here and there. Yeah. You might also notice foreign cultures and foreign travel associated with this as well. But the final phase is the 8th and 2nd house phase, yes, which is death and taxes. Oftentimes, we reap the rewards of how we've done. If we've been selfish or neglectful, we'll often have to reap the consequences. If we've fulfilled our duties, if we've kept our attention on progress and being better people and self-awareness, then we'll reap rewards. However, all of us are a combination of the two. So we're getting a combination of rewards and lessons. I prefer the word lessons. I think the Dalai Lama said, if you lose, don't lose the lesson, right? Now, we may experience literal physical deaths in our families or people around us at this time. Now, of course, that's one of the most severe permutations, so I don't want you to get your panties all up in a bunch about it. I'm sorry, girl. Am I gonna die? No, chill. Chill, chill, chill. Okay? But sometimes we do experience it that way. More often, it's a death in who we thought we were. And remember, this is the final phase, so it leads to the 1st house, 7th house identity phase. And there really is a sense of death or letting go because we're moving on from that previous 18.6 year cycle. Right? We're moving on from that. Now, anyway, that's the final phase. And sometimes we could see material losses, but also material gains. And we're prompted and admonished during this phase to take stock and to better manage our material resources so that we can facilitate and nourish the coming shift in our sense of identity in relationship to ourselves. Yes? So this is very important. Now, in particular right now, back in January, the lunar node shifted, right? The north node went into Pisces, and the south node went into Virgo. This represented the close of one cycle and the beginning of another. Remember, the nodes had been in Aries and Libra. So whatever the whole sign houses of those signs are in your chart will indicate the phase that you were previously in. And you can look at the whole sign houses that Pisces and Virgo are for you to indicate what phase you are going into now. So, what does this mean? Well, the energies are so focused in Pisces right now. And by energies, I really just mean the conditioned, qualified expressions of a planet. For example, Saturn is in Pisces right now, so Saturn's expression will be colored by Pisces. When I say energies, I don't mean the planets are emitting anything or exerting a direct influence on you. I mean, it's the qualities that they indicate. Okay? So when the nodes go into Pisces and Virgo, it's very interesting because, number one, we've had Saturn there in that sign since March of 2023. And Saturn's about to shift into Aries this summer, or I think it's in May, after the nodes had just spent their last cycle in Aries and Libra. So it's almost as if we had this big increase and big new beginnings in whatever whole sign house Aries is for you. And now Saturn is going in to depress those things and teach us a few lessons. Remember, as I said earlier, astrology is about fate. 99% of life just happens to us. We have no choice over it. The 1% that matters is the choices we make about how to respond, about where to put our attention. Eclipses are going to happen regardless. Whatever the government does is going to happen regardless of how we feel or think about it. The best we can do is prove ourselves in the crucible of life, to prove ourselves by living as a living demonstration of what we've realized. What is it that you value? What is it that drives you and motivates you? And ask yourself, is that governing your life? Are you living the most constructive life that you could? How do you see yourself over the next few years? Do you see yourself participating in world events? You may not think you can change the world, but I promise you, you can make a dent in it. Because your value comes from the influence that you have on others. Are you living through love? I know I'm sure not, but we can have the aspiration to. We have to navigate a world of intense emotions, of pain and suffering, and we have to do our best to relieve suffering, to cultivate truth, and live as examples of love in action. Anyway, I hope that was useful for you. This is Saturn Girl. Check out, all my links and all that shit down below. No one really cares. It's like, who cares right now? This is urgency mode. This is a 5-alarm fire. Get ready to help and get your hands dirty and get to work. I love you. Thank you for watching. Like this video and subscribe to my channel. And make sure to click the bell when you subscribe so that you get notified when my new videos drop. And I do the best readings. It's science. You can book through my website, saturngirl.org. And if you can't afford a reading right now, come to my live streams and get one for free. But you have to be subscribed to get notified about them. And please consider tipping me. It helps me make such wonderful content. You can give through super thanks below or become a member of my channel. And remember, I love you. You're beautiful. And have a wonderful, whatever it is you're having.